Tina, if you could please call the roll.
Calling the roll, Mr. Rogers,
Here.
Ms. Simon, Mr. Greenspan,
Here.
Mr. Miller,
Here.
Mr. Brady,
Here.
Mr. Germana,
Here.
Mr. Gallagher,
Here.
Mr. Schron,
Here.
Ms. Conwell is absent today, Mr. Jones, Ms. Conley. There is a quorum.
Great, thank you. I'd like to make a motion to excuse Councilmember Yvonne Conwell from this meeting. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Ms. Conwell is excused. Has anyone signed in for comments on items related to the agenda?
No one has signed in to speak, Mr. Chairman.
Great, thank you. And I will entertain a motion to approve the minutes of November 13th and November 14th. Has everyone had an opportunity to review the minutes?
So moved. Yes.
It's been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Second, moved and seconded. All in favor of approving the minutes?
Aye.
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 Minutes are approved. We have one item that's going to be discussed while I'm at the head of this regarding the consumer affairs. And Gina, if you could please read that item into the record.
Ordinance number 2011-0053, an ordinance establishing a Department of Consumer Affairs and the powers and duties of the Director of Consumer Affairs, and placing the duties and responsibilities of the operation of weights and measures of the county under the direction of the Department of Consumer Affairs.
Great, thank you. This legislation has been in the Environment and Sustainability Committee for several months now. I believe we've had 3 meetings on the topic, and there's been some slight adjustments to the legislation. And we believe that we're at a time now where we'd like to bring this legislation to the Committee of the Whole for a broader discussion around this legislation. Councilmember Brady is the author of this legislation, so I'm going to turn this over to him to kind of give us an overview and explain about the Consumer Affairs Department.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This bill would create a Department of Consumer Affairs for Cuyahoga County. I envision this to occur in perhaps several stages over the next 2 years. This ordinance would, first of all, most easily rebrand the Department of Weights and Measures as the Department of Consumer Affairs. We would be giving a 19th century term, a contemporary name, but more importantly, a contemporary mission. The current state law gives the county auditor the obligation to enforce fairness in the marketplace as set out in the Ohio Revised Code. While there are minimum standards to Ohio's, each of the county's obligations, each of the auditor's obligations, much more is possible and appropriate, I believe. Under our new charter, this responsibility would fall, of course, to the fiscal officer's office, who is supportive. Of course, ultimately, as many of the other responsibilities, this office would be absorbed into the authority of the county executive, who would the county executive is I'm going to speak for the county executive for once. The county executive is strongly in support of establishing this new initiative and expanding the efforts to enforce the law. The executive recently expressed his support at a conference on October the 11th. The conference was called Protecting Main Street, an Investor and Consumer Fraud Summit. Just to give you a brief idea of what was involved in this, that was held in Beechwood last month. There were people there, the U.S. Attorney from the Northern District of Ohio, a special agent in charge of the FBI Cleveland Field Division, U.S. Attorney from the Southern District of Ohio, someone from the Security and Exchange Commission. There was a part of the summit involved financial exploitation of the elderly. We had people there from the Attorney General's office, emerging trends in frauds investigation, U.S. Attorney, Eastern District of Michigan. You get the idea. This is a law enforcement issue. I was very impressed that the executive was very focused on the authority, the special authority given to county government, and this the unique role that we can play in this very important area of law enforcement. A key component in the county's current authority is in the area of deceptive sales and buying practices. Our goal is to make longstanding state law relevant to the times that we live in. Scam and fraud has always been with us, but the challenge in the face of this criminal activity changes, and we need to keep pace with it. This legislation would seek to bring the responsibility for enforcing consumer law and adapt it to our modern culture. We hope to build a small but sophisticated unit that will coordinate with law enforcement agencies at the local, state, and federal level to combat fraud in the marketplace. I think we can accomplish this by bringing in an experienced professional in this field, appointed by the executive, to build over the next year this newly energized department. This is all about law enforcement and the need to try to protect our citizens from criminal predators. It's no secret that the former county auditor may have lacked the will to enforce the law. He is, after all, in jail for public corruption. If this department has the right leadership, we can become a national model and break new ground in protecting our citizens from organized crime. And we have with us, Mr. Chairman, some guests today.
Great. Thank you, Councilman. If I could just add that, I think that this is a great opportunity for the county, and it's would be a great opportunity for the citizens of the county to actually have a place to go to if they feel that they've been defrauded in some way. A lot of times, people may feel that they're the victims of fraud, but aren't sure where to go. They may not be able to afford a lawyer, and I envision this department as being, at a minimum, a central clearinghouse where we can at least have a central place to identify and have a record of allegations of fraud. But there can be a lot more that can be done as well. We have two guests here, Jason Watson, who's the supervisor and special agent at the FBI, and David Weiss, president of the Better Business Bureau of Greater Cleveland. Is there anyone you wanted in?
No particular order.
Mr. Watson?
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me. I'm Jason Watson. I'm a supervisor of our white-collar crime squad and the FBI here in Cleveland. And the unfortunate aspect of investigating all white-collar frauds, and specifically consumer fraud, is that by the time the criminal complaint or allegation comes to the FBI, by the time that we open the case and start pursuing the fraudsters, victims are already out their money. The damage has been done, and in all likelihood, upon the conclusion of the case, the victims will at best get pennies on the dollar, and in all more likelihood, restitution would not be made to victims, as most fraudsters have spent the money far in advance of the conclusion of the case. The challenge that we face with consumer fraud is that there's always going to be more fraudsters than there are investigators, and we always have to, in law enforcement, prioritize our personnel to the cases that we have in front of us. In 2012, with access to the internet and access to telephone systems continually to grow, all it means is that fraudsters now have greater access to that many more victims. When we look at those victims, we recognize that as a population in general in this country, we are getting older. We have an aging population. Baby boomers are starting to retire, and when we look at the vast majority of the wealth in this country, it's going to be in our retirees and in our baby boomers. So going forward, looking at the risk of our citizens in terms of consumer fraud, we have to identify who our potential victims may be and how we go about protecting them. And the biggest single thing that we can do in consumer fraud is educating our citizens on how to avoid becoming a victim. The key thing with a white-collar fraudster is that they have a skill in communicating, in that our citizens oftentimes become trusting of the individuals, which leads them to become a victim. In terms of educating our citizens, the FBI and most law enforcement agencies, and as well as nonprofits and other agencies, try to get out into the community to do outreach, to educate. But one thing that is lacking is a central coordinating aspect to be able to deliver a theme of protecting these consumers to as many folks in our area of responsibility as possible. So when I look at what's ahead of us in terms of preventing the consumer fraud, by far, again, the biggest thing that the FBI would stress is that education is key to prevent the fraud, because at the time that we get a case and start pursuing the fraudsters, our victims are already out and likely will not be made whole. Definitely welcome any questions.
We appreciate you being here. I know that you were out at the conference in Beechwood, and it was important for us to have someone of your stature here today to get the attention of my colleagues. So I very much appreciate your willingness to spend your time over here.
Thank you.
If I can, Agent Watson, how are allegations of fraud brought to you for investigation?
The two major means that we receive our complaints, we can receive a complaint directly from the individual who was victimized or a company who was victimized. We also receive referrals from other agencies, whether it's local or state law enforcement. We receive referrals from consumer agencies like the Federal Trade Commission, the Better Business Bureau. It is many different ways that the actual complaint can be streamlined to the FBI. But like what has been said earlier, oftentimes citizens who are defrauded do have a question of what is the first step that they should take in finding a remedy to their problem. And oftentimes the FBI is not the first agency on their mind, which is why we try to get out there and do the outreach to let folks know that they can come to the FBI to provide their complaint, their allegation.
And if I may, what are the major types of fraud that you see in this area?
For the FBI, our main focus is typically on the corporate fraud aspect and investment frauds. Have moved past the mortgage fraud area in terms of we are beyond that, what was definitely an epidemic. Investment fraud is what I see as being the biggest risk to our citizens in terms of retirement income that folks have, and as well as with the baby boomers, their retirement pools of income, what they're going to be relying on in their later years. The opportunities for fraud is significant as it relates to investments, and when we look at the Cuyahoga County in general, investment fraud related to real estate is what I would describe as ripe in terms of the significant number of homes that could be rehabilitated, and it's one of the most common real estate investment fraud scams involved. As it relates to consumer fraud, there's no doubt that what has not slowed and what has increased in pace over time just by the accessibility is what we refer to as telemarketing and mass marketing fraud. And it's something that I discussed briefly at the Consumer Fraud Summit. And the reason that it's going to continue to increase and it's never going to go away is because telemarketing and mass marketing fraud is easy to do and it's very profitable. And with access to mediums like email and the internet, a fraudster can send out a significant number of contacts with potential victims at the flip of hitting a mouse, hitting the send button, and all you need is one person to reply and become a victim, and it becomes profitable. I'd explained previously at the summit, if you can get one victim a day to send you, let's say, $2,000, and you can do this for 5 straight days, you just receive $10,000. And it's very easy to send an email and end up snagging these so-called victims. It's very difficult, and it's a challenge that law enforcement and the community faces.
Are there any questions from anyone on the committee? Mr. Strong?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Agent, how do you envision the FBI is going to interface with this new department? I would assume that most of what you do is fairly confidential in the background, so how is it going to interface with this?
Typically with the consumer fraud, what we look to do in terms of an education standpoint is we can disclose types of schemes that are becoming more prevalent. It would be assisting with community outreach to educate our citizens in the area, to give them the tips to be aware of, the so-called red flags to be aware of when making decisions that are in their life, whether it's investment decisions, medical decisions, areas that are ripe for fraud and common for fraud. With this organization, this type of organization, what I would envision is the constant communication to discuss what we refer to as crime trends. This way, again, the public can be educated. The ultimate medium would be what the county's organization decides, but we as the FBI could most definitely share the different trends that we are seeing to make sure the public is aware. And an example is oftentimes when there's any kind of tragedy throughout the world, there is an immediate surge in what we refer to as charity scams. Those entities that create look-alike charities that are seeking out donations, coordinating with local agencies to make sure that the message is consistent is what I would see of being the benefit.
But as Mr. Brady, my colleague, pointed out, that we had some problems with some past elected officials, and most of that was kept quiet from the media or from communications during your investigative period for that 2 or 3 year period of time. How do we become aware of that in these consumer things if you're in the middle of an investigation to try and find an incident?
Yes, Mr. Brady?
Ms. Sean, that's exactly where I was going. Just real quickly, 30 years ago, I was the director of the Department of Weights and Measures for County Auditor Tim McCormick. And outside of supervising the inspectors and doing the paperwork that was involved there, as I got familiar with the code, I realized that there was an awful lot more that could be done. During my time there, it was not unusual for me to confer with the sheriff's office, with the FBI, with the Department of Agriculture, with the Better Business Bureau, on a range of things that would come to my attention. And I was getting some advice from some older fellows who knew a lot about the law, who were retired at the time. So even flying by the seat of my pants without the benefit of a great deal of experience, it is not a difficult thing. Obviously, there's a big difference between a public corruption investigation and the scammers that, in this case, come and go from one community to another. They don't stick around long because they know they're going to get caught if they do. And so having someone help to do something about it more quickly, or look into it, or give you advice about how to go about it becomes important, because a lot of this stuff used to be advertisements in newspapers that were fraudulent and misleading, and people who had an eye trained for it could pick up on it. But those same folks, 6 weeks down the road, would be gone. The building would be empty, and they had left town. So there's different. My answer, not his, obviously, is that there are a lot of different levels to this, and there is a level at which the FBI can be helpful.
Well, I applaud you on bringing this forward. I just wanted to make sure I understood whether or not the FBI could really get down in the weeds when we're trying to go after, in a combination of protecting our citizenry and you're protecting the investigation of a crime that we're trying to prosecute. So I didn't want to try to find that balance as to how you walk that thin line.
Right. Typically, as far as what we would disclose, depends on the nature of the case. As it relates to a specific fraud that's referred to us or that we are investigating, the status of the investigation would likely not be disclosed if it would jeopardize the case itself. Most of these white-collar frauds, at the point that the FBI becomes involved, is a point when somebody becomes a victim and the word does get out at that instance. That oftentimes is when a fraud does stop. The benefits that I see in terms of educating the public and how we're involved and can coordinate with the county is getting to a point where we're getting out to the public, making sure they're aware of the different red flags and avoiding the different scams. And the reason is, with consumer fraud, I would say the vast majority of the different advance fee and telemarketing type scams are not committed by individuals in Cuyahoga County, but outside of Cuyahoga County, oftentimes outside of the United States. So those are the keys of educating. When we look at individuals that are local committing these types of fraud, most of the activity would ultimately cease just by word of mouth at the point that an individual becomes aware that they were defrauded and brings that case forward.
Great, thank you, Agent Watson.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Mr. Weiss, thank you for coming today. Again, Mr. Weiss is the president of the Better Business Bureau, serving Greater Cleveland.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be in front of the county council. I appreciate being asked to be here today. I get to see some faces I haven't seen in a long time. Dan and I worked together briefly at the Cleveland Office of Consumer Affairs, back when his hair had color and my hair had hair. And Judge Connolly may not remember, but I was an attorney for Consumer Affairs, and she was, I don't say this just to butter her up, but she was my favorite judge because she was always very kind to us in the courtroom, and she started on time, which wasn't always the case in Muni Court. So it's great to see some familiar faces. The comments will be brief. As I said, I've worked 6 years with the Cleveland Office of Consumer Affairs. Part of that time I was head of the legal staff and acting director of the office. And I've been 29 years now with the Better Business Bureau. So it's fair to say I'm familiar with what's worked and what hasn't during that time. I am very strongly in favor of establishing this department and think it simply makes good sense to put the weights and measures function under the same roof. With the exception of a handful of folks working for the city of Cleveland right now, there really is no local consumer affairs, public consumer affairs office dedicated to this area. We have an outstanding Federal Trade Commission regional office. We have attorneys from the Attorney General's office working downtown, but those agencies' efforts tend to be extended over broad areas. Their enforcement efforts are prioritized, as the agent mentioned, generally require a significant pattern of illegal conduct in order for them to get involved and take action. And even their educational efforts are broad efforts. They're not always designed to reach those that need it most, and they're not really terribly local, and they're definitely not grassroots activity, educational activity. So I think the establishment of a county office would serve a number of very important purposes. First of all, it will be able to focus on consumer education and financial literacy training on a local level, as I mentioned. These efforts can impact the entire county, but will have special value in Cleveland and some of its cash-strapped inner-ring suburbs where the education is most urgently needed. It'll be the ideal office to coordinate efforts among local groups. In recent years, for example, the county made a really valiant effort to create a countywide financial literacy consortium, and I was involved in that. But that effort's now in a suspended state, and a county Department of Consumer Affairs would be the ideal agency to power that program back up. And I should note that it was the county's Department of Development that coordinated the previous effort, and really, while performing admirably and valiantly, they really were probably a bit out of their comfort zone, and they were, frankly, way out of their bailiwick in leading this project. This is the kind of project that would be a Consumer Affairs Department's right in their sweet spot. Finally, a Consumer Affairs Department, a county department, would be able to utilize the expertise of specialists within county government, and hopefully some shared by municipalities, to create or supplement its investigative capability. And that's an immediate plus that's not available to private agencies like mine or even many public agencies. I should also mention that the county would act in many ways as its own referral network, because so many of the people who really don't even know to go to the Attorney General or even to us, maybe when speaking with a caseworker in another department, this would come up, and that person could immediately be assisted by a county Consumer Affairs Department. I do think it's wise to start modestly and build capabilities and capacity over time, but since I may not get in front of this group for another few years, I do want to talk about what I think down the road should look like a little bit. I do feel strongly that in the not-too-distant future, the office would be dramatically strengthened by adding an enforcement component that currently does not exist, again, at a local or county level. Other than several actions every year by the Ohio Attorney General's office that involve merchants in our region, there's virtually no enforcement in our area of consumer protection laws. I work for a private organization. We have no powers of that kind. Most local police departments view consumer complaints as civil disputes. Even if a contractor takes $5,000 from someone and doesn't come back to do a thing, many police departments will say, fine, get a lawyer, that's a contractual matter, even if it's, frankly, more of a felony. The prosecutor's office can pursue violators, but again, they must find evidence of an intent to commit a felony, which many of the situations that local consumer affairs offices deal with are not. But as my experience at the Office of Consumer Affairs for the City of Cleveland showed, there are many violations of existing consumer protection laws taking place every day that are not or cannot practically be addressed by the Attorney General or the County Prosecutor or the Federal Trade Commission or anyone else in this area. Examples are small-time car repair outfits. I'm thinking back to my days at Consumer Affairs that perform unworkmanlike or unnecessary repairs in their backyards or no repairs at all, but they're operating as businesses, and then they're taking people's money and in many cases ripping them off. Or unqualified home improvement contractors roaming the inner city who are, I call them half larcenous, half confused, but by no means operating in the consumer's interest. I worked at Consumer Affairs during the heyday of the Attorney General's Consumer Protection Division, and I can tell you we were still plenty busy. We pursued plenty of businesses that were not on the AG's radar. I think it's important to keep mediation, dispute resolution in the ordinance, or it's not an ordinance, whatever. But I also believe that the department should engage in consumer dispute resolution cautiously. I know for a fact that to do this function well, and we do it about 10,000 times a year, Significant and highly trained and dedicated staff is needed, but the key word is significant. The function is already well covered by the Better Business Bureau and the Attorney General's office. Before taking on complaint handling on a large scale, I think it would be wise to avoid duplication and diffusion of efforts. Complaint handling agencies such as ours can easily identify and refer appropriate complaints to a county department for review if and when that office takes on an enforcement role. Just to wrap up, I personally know the value of having a strong and locally based and locally focused consumer affairs office. Cleveland's consumer affairs office was really nationally renowned as the best of its kind about 30 or 35 years ago and had a really significant impact. I think establishing a county office that can serve a significantly broader area but still a reasonably geographically contained area and an area that is currently underserved would be the ideal. So I strongly support the legislation. Pleased to offer my services, my organization's services, if we can be of assistance in any way in making the office a reality. So thanks for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great. Are there any questions from the committee?
I do.
Ms. Simon?
With regard to the mediation, actually, I had circled that as a question point for me. A lot of the contracts between consumers and the businesses have mandatory, AAA mediation. So what would you envision for this type of mediation that wouldn't otherwise occur in small claims court? Because most municipal courts now have mediation. So what gap would this be filling?
Well, it depends. First of all, it depends what we mean when we're talking mediation. Are we talking about a formal mediation capability where there are trained mediators and caucuses and all that? Or is it something that I think is more accurately called conciliation, where a complaint handler is trying to bring parties together on a resolution informally? The value of both of those is that it keeps it out of the courts, and it's a lot less expensive, especially for the consumer, to get some sort of resolution. We do have formal mediation and arbitration at the BBB, but we don't use it that frequently. We do the conciliation. We get the people. It's a form of mediation, but it's what I'd call informal mediation. I don't know, should I even answer the question or just?
Well, it's preemptive, I guess, to bypass, if possible, the court system. So, okay.
I think it's great to have a county office that municipalities can use to refer people to with complaints. And I can certainly see the county office investigating and getting involved in a number of those complaints. I'm just talking about when you're looking at caseloads of 5,000 or 6,000, and it gets, and consumers who all think that their complaint is the most important thing in your world, or should be, it gets to be a lot of work, and it's not entirely necessary. We do that. The Attorney General's processing about 25,000 a year, and it's not like the county would lose a connection because we work very, very closely. When I was with the city, the Better Business Bureau worked very closely with us. Anytime we brought action, they reported it to the public. Whenever they saw problems, they brought it to our attention. We took legal action if necessary. So there's a great consumer community in this town, but I think having a county office would be a really important focal point for that community.
Mr. Brady?
I just wanted to respond a little bit to the council person on a lower level, but to give you an example. As the director of the Department of Weights and Measures, and inspectors do this as well, if someone is technically breaking the law, okay, but not intentionally necessarily breaking the law, or it's a gray area. Generally, the first thing you do is just explain to the person, the owner, the manager, whoever is in charge, what the problem is, have them deal with it, and then come back around and make sure that they're not a repeat offender. So you avoid, because you can go to the next steps. You can shut places down. We have the authority to do that. But you don't really want to go around, shutting businesses down without being sure that there is real intent to defraud. That is the easy part. The world's changed a lot, and this gets much more complicated as technology changes, and the kinds of scams and frauds that go on are very different than in the 80s. That's for sure. I just also wanted to thank you for all the years of service in this area. I very much appreciate it.
Any other questions, comments?
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Brady?
I was hoping to have Mr. Boyle come forward for a couple of minutes. He has been very, very supportive of my efforts for the last 2 years, and also has some experience in this area.
Mr. Chair and council members, again, thank you for the opportunity to be here. And I'd like to thank the two gentlemen that spoke earlier. I think they really touched upon an important component here, which is that the community of consumer advocates in the Northeast Ohio area really is one of the best. And I had an opportunity for 4 years to work in the Ohio Attorney General's office Consumer Protection section, so dealt with their agencies and some of them particularly, but also some other agencies that are involved in this process. So, for example, and I know Councilman Brady has spoken to representatives from the FTC, John Steiger, and some of those folks who also have been involved in the discussion as we move forward on the establishment of this Consumer Affairs Department. But that really is important because it is that network that allows the communication tentacles to touch upon what all of the other individuals and all the other entities are seeing, so that we can get the word out about what's happening. I was stunned when I started at the Attorney General's office to see the elaborate nature of some of the scams going on, and then the exact opposite of the really simplistic scams that were out there that were both making lots and lots and lots of money. And with that in mind, the more kind of hands-on deck that we can get, I think the better off we will all be. I agree, and before I go into some of the comments, I think it's appropriate to publicly comment and thank Councilman Brady for taking the leadership on this issue, and I've stated that publicly on behalf of my boss, Executive Fitzgerald. But I do think it's appropriate because it is really your leadership that has brought this issue to the forefront, and Khalil as well, I know, doing some of the work on this as well. I think that the appropriate measure is outlined by Councilman Brady as well as by the two gentlemen that spoke, would be to make sure that we get our sea legs, as it is, on this enterprise before we jump in and really start digging into minutia. And with that in mind, I think kind of operating in a slower fashion to let it grow, to let it develop, to see what the needs are and what the strengths of the individuals that are in there probably is the better course of conduct at this point. And obviously, as it relates to that, the leadership of who is going to be in charge of that department will be vital as well. Some of the other aspects that I think we do need to talk about is that sometimes, as Councilwoman Simon had mentioned, the mediation aspects are less formal than perhaps we were thinking. And so, for example, when I worked at the Attorney General's office, sometimes we'd get a call and there'd just be a simple call to the supplier saying, hey, this person called. And that may be all it took to resolve it. Now, in my mind, we view that as some level of mediation. While it doesn't fit within the legal parameters of what we expect mediation as opposed to an arbitration or something along the formalities of those, it does, in my mind, mesh with what I would expect that this organization would be doing as we move forward. Some of the other things that I do think are important to look at are that we get moving as soon as possible. Councilman Brady has been an advocate on this for quite some time, and I'm optimistic that we can at least get the bones in place so that this enterprise can move forward. There are a lot of enterprises, as I indicated, here in the Northern Ohio area that deal with consumer affairs really, really well. Terry Sullivan from the Postal Inspectors, I'm sure you gentlemen have dealt with him quite a bit. HUD Enforcement's SEC folks, the county prosecutor's office, the federal investigators. Even, nobody wants to deal with the press, but Cheryl Harris from the Plain Dealer is one of the most intelligent consumer individuals in this area, and it's really a luxury to have somebody like that can really talk about those issues in a very knowledgeable fashion. And that is the realm that we have here in Cuyahoga County, and I think that is the appropriate platform to really get this body moving. One of the first things that I mentioned to Councilman Brady when this discussion took place was, in my mind, the appropriate starting point for this conversation necessarily had to be with Cynthia Sitch, who is the Consumer Affairs Director in Summit County. And I didn't refer to her only because Summit County being the other charter form of government, county charter form of government, but because I know Cynthia and I know the work that she does, and I know how successful she is at resolving the matters that come through the Summit County Consumer Affairs Department. They have a very strong enterprise there. And as I mentioned at one of the previous committee hearings, I can tell you that on numerous occasions I would receive complaints from aggrieved consumers that were based in Summit County, and I would take the information in. I would call the consumer, and I can tell you on several occasions the comments from the suppliers when I called them saying, hey, I got a consumer from Barberton who's complained that blah, blah, blah. Several times they'd say, we already resolved this case with Cynthia Sitch and the Summit County Consumer Affairs Department. They had beaten us to the punch. Because they were a more nimble organization, were able to really get some resolution before the level of complaints that had called for action from the state side. But I think it's a great idea, and I know that Councilman Brady has spoken to Executive Fitzgerald about this. From that level, obviously, there's a support from executive and through the fiscal office as well. And from the experience that I had with the Attorney General's office, I really commend this body for this consideration. I think it's a great idea. And I know that those are the thoughts. I got a little troubled when Councilman Brady said that he was speaking on behalf of Executive Fitzgerald. I thought we were perilously close to a problem situation, but unfortunately, his comments are ones that I know that the executive shares as well. So I thank you, and I lend my support on behalf of Executive
Yeah,
Fitzgerald.
I did step over the line there.
I was going to say how I've been in council or in Judge Connolly's chambers numerous times, always on time, always on time. And I don't know whether any of the members have any questions, but I'll certainly be happy to answer in the best of my ability.
Are there any questions? The intent of this meeting was to merely have a discussion. There was no action to be taken on this at this time. Do you have a timeline?
The committee, we'd gone before the councilman's committee and wanted to have a broader discussion for people that don't happen to sit on the committee. We've got a lot of support for the bill, and I hope those of you who have any questions will feel free to talk to me or Khalil, who's been working closely with me for quite a long time on this. We had the second reading in committee, and I was hoping that if the council is prepared, that we could have final passage on our meeting on the 11th of December, if that's appropriate.
Mr. Miller.
Mr. Chairman and colleagues, I do strongly support the legislation and just want to commend Councilman Brady for what I believe is the right strategy, that instead of us trying to say that we know everything about what this department should do and how it should be organized and so on, that we're going to go out and find someone who's a real expert in this area and take advantage of their expertise to build a department, to capitalize on opportunities, to see where we fit in regard to other agencies and provide a real public service. And I think it'll work well and serve our constituents well.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move that we put this on the agenda for moving to the regular council, and I think we have next meeting will be December the 11th.
I don't know if we have to do that. It's already, it should already be on because.
No.
It's referred to committee of the whole, so therefore it's here until it gets
Okay,
out.
so I move we put this on the regular agenda for December 11th.
Second.
Okay, can I say something before we?
Yes.
I just wanted to say that I want to add my name, and I wholly support this. I attended the 8th Judicial Conference this year, and the focus of that was on the deterioration of our consumer rights through the courts and how we are, at every level, losing our right to trial, juries, being confined to these mandatory arbitration clauses now. Such depths that I don't think anybody really realizes that our due process rights are slowly being taken from us. So this is going to counteract that to the best of our ability as the county. So I appreciate this and support it.
And I'm on as a sponsor, and I just want to reiterate my support of this. And I feel that, we as a county, as county government, we really touch a lot of people. And the potential for I just imagine that there's a lot of things going on out there that we're just not aware of. People just don't know who to go to. Oftentimes, people are embarrassed if they've been defrauded, and they choose just to keep it to themselves. But we touch and reach a lot of people, and we reach them in ways that are different than law enforcement. And so I think that we really, this department could really benefit the community and the county as a whole. So again, thank you, Mr. Brady, for bringing this forward. Mr. Germana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to weigh in and thank Councilman Brady for bringing this forward. I think solving the problem once something happens is kind of too late, and I think where this is great is in the prevention. On many different levels. I mean, seniors are commonly targets, and we have a number of senior programs throughout. I know in the insurance industry, identity theft is become a very big problem, but because of communication on how to prevent identity theft, people know how to change their habits with Social Security numbers, bank accounts, and so on and so forth. So I think the communication that a coordinated county Office of Consumer Affairs can do in publicizing some of these prevention things so that you don't get stuck. Because like the FBI agent had said, once it happens to you, it's pretty much too bad. You're a victim, and the chances of catching somebody is kind of rough. Prevention is very important, and the communication using the county's website, I think, is probably one of the greatest services we can do.
Great, thank you. It's been moved and seconded to move ordinance 0053 to the full council for consideration under third reading. All in favor say aye. Aye. Great, thank you. I'd like to thank our guests again for... Oh, any opposed? It passes and moves forward. I'd like to thank our guests for coming today. It was very informative information that you provided to us, so thank you. And I'd like to turn it over to Councilman Miller.
We'll take a 5-minute break, and we'll be back with Mr. Miller on the budget item.